me here. The topic of my paper is Do Sages Weep? Christ's Sorrow in Augustine's and Aquinas' Doctrine of Passions. First, introduction. Classical Greek philosophy established the doctrine of affections as an essential part of psychology and ethics. It does not, however, pay much specific attention to sadness or sorrow. The catalogues of passions, as we have received them from Plato and especially from Aristotle, hardly mention sorrow. At the fore are anger, fear, lust, and joy. It is first in Hellenism, namely in the Stoa, that sorrow is given special significance, though an explicitly negative one. Cicero warns against sorrow, which he compares with a hideous wild beast that can destroy a human's life. The perfection of the Stoic wise man is demonstrated precisely through his complete liberation from a particular passion, the passion of sorrow. Christianity discusses sorrow frequently and acknowledges, at least in part, a positive significance in it. On the whole, the passages in the New Testament that recount the movement of the passions in Jesus are quite limited in number. Apart from the violent cleansing of the temple, according to Matthew 21, the Gospels prefer to paint the picture of a quiet teacher and master. The few pericopes that narrate the sorrow of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of John, thus stand out all the more. The first of these pericopes is found in John chapter 11, where the story is told of the death of Lazarus and his resurrection by Jesus. Mary relays to Jesus, who has just arrived in Bethany, that her brother Lazarus died 4 days ago. John writes, I quote, "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept." Unquote. The second instance is found in John chapter 12, in the middle of Jesus' last public speech. There it is written, quote, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour." Unquote. In the patristic and medieval exegesis, this passage was connected to Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, conveyed only in the Synoptic Gospels. In the night before his crucifixion, facing certain death, Jesus retreated with his disciples to that garden. The Gospel of Matthew says, and I quote from Matthew 26, "Jesus began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then he said unto his disciples, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. And he fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father in heaven, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you wilt." Unquote. The passages of the Gospel telling about Jesus' tears will provide significant problems for the exegetes of antiquity and the Middle Ages. I have just said that classical Greek philosophy does not have much interest in the passion of sorrow, but that is not entirely accurate, since there is a notable exception, namely Plato's dialogue Phaedo. In the Phaedo, Plato tells us about Socrates' execution. Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking the poisoned cup. In his last hours in prison, he has his friends around him, proving to them the difference of soul and body and the soul's immortality. When the prison clerk finally reaches him the cup, he drinks it quietly and cheerfully. For Socrates, imminent death is not a proper reason for fear or sorrow, because the soul will live on. But his disciples all burst in tears and weep excessively. I quote from Plato's Phaedo. Up to that time, most of us had been able to restrain our tears fairly well, but when we watched him drinking and saw that he had drunk the poison, we could do so no longer. But in spite of myself, my tears rolled down in floods. But Apollodorus, who had been weeping all the time before, then wailed aloud in grief and made us all break down, except Socrates himself. But he said, "What conduct is this, you strange men? Keep quiet and be brave." Then we were ashamed and controlled our tears. Unquote. In Socrates' death scene, as depicted by Plato, sorrow does play a role, but a negative one. Socrates himself is free of sorrow even in his hour of death. His friends, however, shed many tears, but Socrates forbids them to weep because it is against reason. By his injunction, Socrates makes his friends ashamed of their tears, so they might control themselves. In some sense, Socrates' death scene bears a striking resemblance to Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. But Socrates, the pagan sage, accepts his cup quietly and cheerfully, while Jesus Christ, the Son of God, seems to break down in sorrow, weeping and asking his Father to let his cup pass from him. Jesus does what Socrates forbids his friends to do because it is foolish, crying in the face of death. Thus, in the Gospel, Jesus acts contrary to what is expected from a wise man in antiquity. The Gospels accentuate sorrow by attributing this emotion in particular to Jesus. In doing so, they stand in stark contrast to the Platonic and Stoic view, according to which the wise person is never sorrowful. In the following reflections, I will treat the interpretations of Jesus' sorrow by Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. Both wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John. Moreover, both authors address the problem of emotions outside of their Bible commentaries in a very principled and philosophical manner. In City of God, Book 9, Augustine takes up a dispute with Stoic doctrine, and he develops in Book 14 of the same work a Christian understanding of the passions, which will become a paradigm for the succeeding centuries. In addition, the autobiographical parts of his confessions contain numerous moving illustrations of sorrow. Thomas Aquinas offers an encompassing treatise on the passions in his Summa Theologica, Prima Secundae, Questiones 22 through 48. That's 26 questiones on the problem of the passions. 5 of these questions, namely 25 through 29, handle the topic of sorrow specifically. Aquinas also covers this topic when he examines the anthropological foundations in the first part of the Summa Theologica, and in his discussions of specific theological considerations in the Secunda Secundae, as well as in his discussion of Christology in the third part of the Summa Theologica. Throughout these discussions, Thomas refers back to Augustine as well as to Aristotle, especially Aristotle's works De Anima and the Nicomachean Ethics. Aquinas formulates the inherited Christian interpretation of the passions upon the background of Aristotle's anthropology and ethics, which were intensively studied in the 13th century. In his treatise on the passions, Thomas cites Augustine more than any other thinker after Aristotle, and references to Augustine dominate his questions on sorrow. It is therefore also the connection between Augustine and Aquinas in the history of reception that compels me to investigate their thinking on emotions together. I will first explain what passions are and why they were seen as an ethical problem in antiquity and medieval times. I then will examine the contributions of Augustine and Aquinas to the doctrine of affections in general and to the understanding of sorrow in particular. Finally, I will explicate how these two thinkers interpret the passages in the Gospel of John that touch upon the sorrow of Jesus. So, section 2, what are passions and why are they an ethical problem? The Greek expression for what concerns us here is pathos, with its accompanying verb patein. Latin equivalents are passio, affectus, but also turbatio or perturbatio. In German and in English, we speak of passions and of affections. The German word for this is Leidenschaft. And this word Leidenschaft is used in German nowadays mostly with a positive connotation. The case is similar in English too. Someone who lives and acts passionately dedicates himself entirely to a subject matter and commits himself fully. So a passionate chess player, for example, or even a passionate lover. The Greek patein and the Latin word pati mean to suffer. So the translations of Leidenschaft, Leiden means suffering in Germany, the translation of Leidenschaft and passion are not false. But in antiquity and medieval times, due to the suffering contained in the word, passio, passion, had a negative connotation. Against the background of the ideal of a reasonable and thus autonomously acting person, the passions posed a problem. The passions concern the human capacities of striving and desiring, the appetite. Passions are ways of desiring, positive or negative, and they possess relevance for action. How do these manners of desiring then represent a suffering and not only a doing? There is suffering insofar as the striving is initiated externally, primarily through perception or through images created on the basis of perceptions. This initiation happens automatically, in vitus, as Augustine says, or by necessity, according to Thomas, as soon as perceptions are connected to our natural striving toward goods and to our defense against ills. On account of this connectedness to perception, it is a matter of movements of sensual appetites, appetitus sensitivus, which stand in contrast to intellectual appetites, appetitus intellectivus. A passion is not occasioned by the actor himself, that is, it does not come from within, but from the outside. In this respect, the passions are opposed to the ideal of a self-determining will. For Thomas, the more an action stems from reason and will, and not from the impulse of the passions, the more that action is voluntary and grounded in itself. The passions are called movements of the appetitus sensitivus, the sensual appetite, because the person quasi suffers his own striving. It is in this regard that the expression affect has its validity. In the passion, the person is affected and moved by something outside of itself. The designations turbatio or perturbatio express the movement of desire from a condition of rest to an excited condition. The passions are, to begin with, without reason. They arise naturally, thus without reflection. In contrast to animals, however, humans face a particular problem. Humans strive toward goods and seek to avoid ills in order to lead a happy life. But often deliberation is required in order to distinguish what is truly good or bad from what merely appears good or bad. A visit to the dentist is, in short term, seen as an ill that may cause fear and is to be avoided. Reason, however, states that it produces a good, namely the preservation of the teeth. In the long term, then, it is better to overcome the fear and submit oneself to the treatment. To take another example, the prospect of fame or great wealth awakens in humans a passionate desire, making them overestimate the value of these goods and expect more happiness from them than they can truly provide. Actions under the power of passions often aim at apparent goods that are, in truth, ills, or they avoid apparent ills that are, in truth, worthy goods. Incorrect judgment of goods and ills make humans act morally false and cause them unhappiness. The passions are not only without reason, though. They tend to override reason and solely determine human actions. The passions possess substantial motivational power and are capable of suspending reason as the basis of action. Whoever is filled with rage or is blinded by jealousy or greed, thus whoever acts out of affect, acts unreasonably and later regrets his actions. For ethically good action, which leads humans to happiness and fulfillment, it is therefore imperative that reason not be overcome. It has to moderate the passions and regulate them through reflection. If they arise by necessity and are already given for reason, then they have to be placed under the guidance of reason. The virtuous person does not allow himself to be carried away by the passions. He rather restrains them with the aid of his reason and directs them into their proper channels. Section 3. The unique contributions of Augustine's doctrine of the passions. Augustine made at least 3 profoundly influencing contributions to the Christian doctrine of affections for antiquity and the Middle Ages. First, he presented the thesis that affections belong to human nature and are therefore unavoidable. Second, he emphasized that the passions are not to be rejected and that they can even be of estimable ethical value. Third, he interprets the susceptibility of the soul to the passions as a sign of the soul's weakness, a weakness that constitutes earthly life after the fall. With his first thesis, Augustine rebuffs the Stoic ideal of apathy. With his second, he opts for the Platonic and Aristotelian doctrine of affections, and with the third, he transcends this doctrine toward a Christian interpretation of human life. In City of God, Book 9, Augustine argues against the Stoic ideal of apathy. The human, according to the Stoics, should not have any passions. They are always bad because they lead the soul away from the happiness of rest. For the Stoics, the therapy of the affections consists in helping humans toward emotionlessness and toward soulful immutability. The wise person is without passions. They acknowledge, however, certain emotive traits that are reconcilable with apathy. These traits are the so-called eupatheiai, so oipateiai in Greek, and these are reasonable emotions, which are solidly grounded and do not disturb. Even the wise person has such reasonable emotions according to Stoic doctrine. One emotion is excluded from this list, though, namely sorrow. The wise person, per definition, does not have any reason to feel sorrow, for the sole ill which could legitimately make him sorrowful is foolishness. But the wise person is wise, not foolish. Consequently, there could never be a reason for sorrow. The central point of Augustine's anti-Stoic directive is that it is not a matter of whether one has a passion, but why one has it. This thesis is frequently quoted in the Middle Ages. According to Augustine, the passions are not reprehensible in and of themselves. The reasons why one has them can be good or bad, which in turn render them good, either good or bad. Augustine writes, I quote from the City of God, "In our ethics, we do not so much inquire whether a pious soul is angry as why he is angry, not whether he is sad, but what is the cause of his sadness, not whether he fears, but what he fears." Unquote. If fear, sadness, desire, and joy are guided by reason and in the service of the love of God, then they are positive movements of striving. If not, then they are negative. Quote, "The character of the human will is of moment, because if it is wrong, these motions of the soul will be wrong, but if it is right, they will be not merely blameless, but even praiseworthy." Unquote. Augustine thus distinguishes between a good sadness and a bad sadness, as well as between a justified fear and a reprehensible fear. Among the good reasons to be sad, Augustine includes the fact that we do not reside in eternal life, but in an earthly life afflicted with numerous ills. He thus includes our own suffering and the suffering of others, as well as our own sins and the sins of others. Augustine suggests that as a consequence of sin, humans have in them two sources of desire that stand in opposition to each other, namely reason and passions. God and the angels, he claims, do have a will, but no passions. Before sin, human persons were uniform. Through sin, they rent themselves from God, who is unity itself, and lost the unity of their soul, leading to the opposition of reasonable and sensual striving. This antagonism henceforth determines all our human earthly life. While Augustine concedes that prior to sin, humans knew two emotions, namely joy and love, he contends that these emotions stemmed from reason and therefore were in perfect accordance with it. Such perfect accordance and original unity will first be restored after the resurrection of the body in the future life with God. For Augustine, the time of earthly existence is characterized by the weakness of the soul as a result of the fall to sin. With regard to the passions, this weakness is demonstrated by the fact that they are suffered. Passions come over us, even when we do not want them. And this occurs even with the good passions that are in accordance with reason and the will's orientation toward God. Augustine claims that, I quote, "Even when these affections are well regulated and according to God's will, they are peculiar to this life, not to that future life we look for, and that often we yield to them against our will. And thus sometimes we weep in spite of ourselves, being carried beyond ourselves, not indeed by culpable desire, but by praiseworthy charity. In us, therefore, these affections arise from human infirmity." Unquote. In earthly life, humans are not autonomous. Even good passions come over the soul. They are not produced by reason, but precede the activity of reason and first have to be controlled. Augustine witnesses in the precedence of the passions the infirmity that characterizes earthly human existence. His understanding of the passions as signs of human weakness represents another one of his major contributions to the doctrine of medieval times. Fourth section, the passions in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas explicitly distinguishes the passions that precede the judgment of reason and willful decision from the passion that succeeds them. So the first ones he calls in Latin passio praeveniens or praecedens, and the second he calls passio sequens. This use of language already can be found in Augustine, but Thomas makes it more explicit than the Bishop of Hippo. Within the interplay between reason and the passions, Thomas paints two possible scenarios. First, the passions can precede the judgment of reason. He deems this scenario problematic because the passions in this case may weaken and cloud reason. According to Thomas, it is ethically better to do a work of love from a judgment of reason than from the affection of compassion or pity. Being good resides in reason as in a root. If it spreads from the root to the whole plant, then the good will be all the more perfect. Thus, for Thomas, moral perfection is increased when humans are moved toward the good not only by their intellectual faculty of desire, which is voluntas, but also proceeding from this faculty by their sensual faculty of desire. In this second scenario, the passions follow reason. And this pattern can occur in two different ways. First, such that the intellectual desire moves toward a good and the lower desire moves with it. As such, passion becomes a sign of the intention of the will. Or second, a person can make a choice on the basis of the judgment of reason and then be gripped by a passion that serves the execution of reason's command, such that he does the good all the more swiftly and powerfully. In the latter case, the passion does not merely demonstrate the moral quality of the action, it actually increases the merit. Whereas the following passion, the passio sequens, increases both the praiseworthiness of a good deed and the blameworthiness of a bad one, the preceding passion decreases both because it constrains human freedom. Like Augustine, Thomas is of the opinion that after the fall, sensual desire is no longer fully subject to reason. In the state of innocence, this subjection was complete, and consequently humans then had only passiones sequentes, following passions. In the wake of sin, humans now find themselves in a situation in which passions sometimes precede reasoned judgment and sometimes succeed it. Particularly, the sudden motions in sensual desire demonstrate the fact that this subordination under the command of reason is not complete. Thomas interprets biblical passages like Romans 7:15, "For what I would, that I do not, but what I hate, that I do." And also Romans 7:23, "But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind," as evidence of the sensual appetite not always following the command of reason. Thomas describes this partial independence of the sensual appetite over against reason with the help of the distinction Aristotle makes in his work Politics between despotic and political rule. The soul rules over the body like a despot, whose subjects do not have their own will. In contrast, reason commands sensual desire only like a king, whose subjects do not necessarily obey, but may instead resist. Even the virtuous person, Thomas concedes, will not get beyond such a political rule during his earthly life, because in him too there will arise sudden movements of the sensual appetite that precede the exercise of reason, even if he does not consent to them, but tempers and channels them. He insists that the complete subjugation of sensual desire to reason, as it was in the state of innocence, first will recommence in the perfection of the life beyond. Sorrow belongs, according to Thomas, to the highest intensity level of passions. All of the passions, according to Thomas, possess a relation to the body, but sadness has the gravest somatic effects. Human life, Thomas claims, consists in a motion that extends from the heart to the members of the body. This motion has a set natural measure. Desiderium, amor, gaudium, they intensify this motion and at times beyond its natural measure unto excess. But despair, fear, and in particular sorrow effectuate a retraction and are not only opposed quantitatively to the life movement stemming from the heart, but even qualitatively. The most severe form of sorrow, which leads to melancholy or even to madness, mania, does not merely overwhelm the reason, it also renders the body motionless and paralyzes the organ that is closest to the soul, namely the voice. Such a person falls silent. Thomas asks whether moral virtue and passion can coexist, or whether they exclude each other. In particular, he asks, can moral virtue coexist with sorrow, or does virtue exclude sorrow? In the question concern here, in the Summa Theologica, Thomas addresses the sorrow of Jesus as it is depicted in Matthew 26. He concludes that since Jesus was virtuous in the highest degree, sorrow must be reconcilable with virtue. He refers to Augustine's critique of the Stoic doctrine of affections in general and of the doctrine of the oipateiai, which explicitly states that the virtuous person is never sad. Thomas adopts this critique and offers 4 reasons why even the wise person legitimately may feel sad. First, the human person is composed of body and soul. Bodily disturbances may be encountered. He is thinking here of pain, sickness, and death, that are evils even for the wise person. Second, the wise person may and should be saddened by his sins. Even if he is without grave sins, not even he is entirely without sins. Third, even if the wise person does not sin anymore, he surely committed sins in the past that he still now rightly laments. Fourth, it is not only his own sins that sadden him, but also those of others. For these reasons, virtue is reconcilable with sorrow. Such sorrow is, Thomas claims, morally praiseworthy and beyond that useful, because it decisively helps one more adamantly avoid ills. Nonetheless, the reconciliation between virtue and sorrow presupposes that the sorrow is regulated and contained by reason. The extreme form of melancholia or mania leads to the destruction of reason and therefore cannot coexist with virtue. Fifth section, the sorrow of Jesus and its significance for coping with the emotions. I would like now to turn to Augustine and Aquinas' interpretations of the aforementioned gospel passages. I will do so in inverse historical order, beginning with Aquinas and concluding with Augustine. So first, Thomas Aquinas, Jesus' sorrow teaches the propriety of sorrow. In the third part of the Summa Theologica, question 15, Thomas comments on the passions in Christ in general and on the question of sorrow in particular. Drawing on Augustine, Thomas explains that Christ had the faculty of sensual desire, and accordingly he had passions. His passions, however, differed in 3 respects from purely human passions. First, they were never directed to anything forbidden, which is frequently the case with us humans. Second, they emerged always only in accordance under the directive of reason, whereas they often precede the judgment of reason in us. And third, the passions in us occasionally usurp reason, which they never did in Christ. In him, they constantly remained confined to the sensual appetite. It is thus in this manner that the mention of Christ's felt sorrow in Matthew 26 is to be understood. The reasons for his sorrow were his approaching suffering and death and the sins of his disciples and the Jews. Thomas thus contests the Stoic doctrine, which completely precludes sorrow for the wise person. Furthermore, Thomas explains that even though his sorrow never overwhelmed his reason, Christ nevertheless felt a maximum of sadness. Christ renounced what is even possible for the virtuous person, namely the attenuation of sorrow through moral virtue. In order to render satisfaction for the sins of all humans, he allowed the lower powers of the soul to flow freely in him, and took unto himself the greatest possible sorrow, which, however, never exceeded the bounds of reason. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, Thomas first of all addresses the dogmatic questions that emerge from the sorrow of Jesus. The passions are precisely characteristic of humanity. Like Augustine, Thomas believes that God and the angels have will but no passions. Since it is written, though, that Jesus wept and was moved, then it must intend to demonstrate that Jesus did not only have a divine nature, but also a human nature. Thomas thus sought to avoid two dogmatic errors. First, that Jesus in his godliness was sad, which is impossible because the passions entail a suffering and God is not capable of suffering. Second, that Christ, as the Arians claimed, did not have an anima, a soul, but in its place was the Word, the verbum. The Arians concluded that this verbum was lower than the Father since it suffered a passion. Against the Arians, Thomas maintained that when Christ wept, he definitely did have a passion and thus did possess an anima, a soul. And against Apollinaris, for example, he contended that Christ was indeed capable of suffering, but only as a human. More than the other evangelists, John attributed the frailties of human nature to Jesus because he emphasized more than the others the divine power of Jesus. He therefore taught the dual nature in Christ. Why did Christ sorrow? In his exegesis of the Lazarus scene, Thomas accentuates the pietas, that is the appropriateness of Jesus' sadness. Jesus wept for good reasons. The sadness of Mary, Lazarus' sister, the sadness of the Jews, and the ill that they encountered upon the death of a beloved. In short, Jesus wept with those who wept. He also wept on account of sin. According to Thomas, Christ wept in order to demonstrate that one should be saddened by sin. His sorrow was accompanied by anger. Christ is angered over human sin, which has brought about death, and he is indignant about the reign of death and the devil. Through his tears over sin, he gives us to understand symbolically that whoever is resurrected from his sins should henceforth lament his earlier sins. How did Jesus sorrow? Jesus was reasonably sad. That means his passions were subject to his reason. Not only did his sorrow arise for good reasons, but also the rational part of his soul remained removed from the shock to the soul. In Jesus, reason maintained its rule by evaluating the reasons for the passion and by establishing a measure for the agitation. Following Jerome, Thomas calls the passions controlled by reason pro passiones. In contrast, passio pertains only to those passions that sweep reason in their current. Christ's sorrow was a passion moderated by reason, that is a pro passio. According to Thomas, the Gospels express this manner when they write, quote, Jesus began to be sore amazed. So that's the literal translation from the Latin. Jesus began, coepit, to be sore amazed and to be very heavy, or he began to be sorrowful in Matthew 26. In what manner was Christ's soul moved? Thomas brings the idea of the passion that follows, the passio sequens, to bear on this topic. The sorrow of Jesus was not caused externally, but came from within himself. His own reason commanded him to sorrow. In the Latin text of the Gospel, this relation is expressed in the reflective phrase turbavit se ipsum. That's from Johannes chapter 11. Turbavit se ipsum. He troubled himself. For us humans, even when our emotions arise for a good reason, and are moderated by reason, they precede for the most part the judgment of the ratio. They occur in a sudden movement of the sensual appetite that the ratio has to bring under control upon their emergence. But for Christ, even the first movements of sensual desire originated from his own power. We humans cry because of a sorrow that arises in us by necessity, because it comes from the outside. The sorrow of Christ, in contrast, arises by order of reason, because the only passions that are in him are the ones he himself has summoned. As Thomas writes, the lower powers of the soul in Christ are subordinated to the ratio, such that they could do and suffer solely what the ratio ordered. The sorrow of Christ represents for Thomas an example of passio sequens. Christ decides freely to become sad. His sadness has good reasons. It remains within the bounds of reason, and in particular, it emerges not as a sudden movement of sensual desire from an external cause, but from Christ's reason and will. In accordance with his power, his potestas, Christ's sensual desire is perfectly subordinated to his ratio. In him, the passions never precede the judgment of reason, but always follow it. Although Thomas stresses that Christ really did feel sadness, and indeed in the greatest possible intensity, he portrays Christ's reason as exercising a despotic rule over the passions rather than a political one. It is in this regard that Christ fulfills the ideal of the human being, which was realized before the fall and will not be again until the eschatological consummation. For Thomas's exegesis, however, John 12:27 poses a peculiar problem. I quote, "Now my soul is troubled," unquote, and the concluding prayer, "Father, save me from this hour." Thomas reads this passage, as Augustine does, in connection with the scene at Gethsemane, depicted by Matthew, where Jesus says to his disciples, quote, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful even unto death," unquote. These utterances of Jesus, in light of his approaching death, are difficult to reconcile with the doctrine of self-induced passions controlled by reason. Sorrow unto death does not appear to be moderated by the ratio, much less brought about by it. And how can Jesus ask the Father to save him from this hour when he knows exactly that his death and resurrection is the will of God, and thus his own will with respect to his divinity? Did Jesus lose the righteousness of will that consists in willing according to God's will? Christ appears in Gethsemane to have suffered an emotional collapse that does not correspond to his honorary title, Wisdom of the Father. How does Thomas interpret these words? Thomas claims that these words do not stem from Christ's reason, rather that the ratio speaks here merely in persona of the natural affection which does not want to die. Christ therefore sets reason, as it were, aside for a moment in order to let natural desire speak, and it is this desire alone that utters the prayer to be spared. On Thomas's interpretation, Christ's reason subsequently speaks again, reprimanding the natural affection, saying, "Father, glorify thy name." Thomas ultimately offers only a brief indication of why Christ allows natural desire to speak. Christ, he claims, wanted to give us an example of how to bear death. If he had been free of passions even in Gethsemane, then some could have claimed, and I quote from Thomas, "O Lord, you have philosophized well on death, but you do not know the pain of human existence and will not be disturbed by death," unquote. That is why Christ allows natural desire to speak, in order to demonstrate that he is sorrowful in the face of death. Otherwise, he would not have been a credible teacher in the art of dying. According to Thomas, Christ shows us how we should comport ourselves in the face of death. Whoever in this situation says, as Christ does, "My soul is sorrowful unto death," should also say with Christ, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Unquote. Second, Augustine, the sorrowful Jesus consoles the sorrowful. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, Augustine discusses at length all three passages on the sorrow of Jesus, and he draws on the Gethsemane scene as well. He places at the center of his discussion the reflexive formulation, "He troubled himself," et turbavit se ipsum, from John 11, and interprets the other two passages from John 12 and 13 explicitly in this sense. Augustine clearly highlights that Jesus' sorrow was a following passion, a passio sequens, not a preceding passion. Due to his power, Christ, Augustine argues, only would have been passionately moved if he wanted to be and however he wanted to be. Whereas humans in their infirmity are affected externally and experience passions often against their will, Christ is always master of his passions. Augustine inquires, as Thomas later does, why Christ then decided to be sorrowful. He develops his first response on the basis of the Lazarus story. It is the same response Thomas will later give. He did so to teach us what should make us sorrowful. His second response in reading John 12 and 13 goes beyond the response of Thomas, however. Christ decided to be sorrowful in order to console us. Augustine represents Christ not only as a teacher of how to cope with affections, but also in emphatic fashion as a consoler. In his exegesis of the Lazarus story, Augustine first takes up the phrase, "he troubled himself." Augustine writes, quote, "For who could trouble him save he himself?" Unquote. And in the same passage, quote, "You are troubled against your will. Christ was troubled because he willed." Unquote. Christ does not succumb to human frailty. That is, his passions never have their origin outside of himself. He rather summons them. Augustine interprets the 4 days after Lazarus' death as a symbol of sin from which he extrapolates the significance of Jesus' sorrow. Quote, "Why is it then that Christ troubles himself, but to intimate to you how you ought to be troubled when weighed down and crushed by so great a mass of iniquity?" Unquote. Christ places himself in this situation, even in sorrow, in order to teach us why we should be sorrowful, namely because of sins, primarily our own. Quote, "For why did Christ weep but to teach man to weep? Wherefore did he groan and trouble himself, but to intimate that the faith of one who has just cause to be displeased with himself ought to be, in a sense, groaning over the accusation of wicked works?" Unquote. In his interpretation of John 12, "Now my soul is troubled," Augustine juxtaposes human infirmity and divine power with regard to sadness. He first inquires whether the sorrow of Jesus could shake Christian faith, questioning how the words, "If any man serve me, let him follow me," that's John 12:26, can coexist with the words immediately following, "Now my soul is troubled." That's John 12:27. Addressing Christ, Augustine asks, quote, "How biddest thou my soul follow you, if I behold your soul troubled? How shall I endure what is felt to be heavy by your strength so great? What is the kind of foundation I can seek if the rock is giving way?" Unquote. Augustine offers an answer in his exposition of the third passage concerning Jesus' sorrow from John 13. He explains that the sorrow of Jesus in no way entails the crumbling of the rock. Christ does not lose power. He takes on our infirmity, and he does so for us. Quote, "He who died for us was also himself troubled in our place." Unquote. What is it, we may ask, that Christ does for us when he takes on our infirmity, when he fears, when he weeps? The first step of Augustine's response is to reject once again the Stoic doctrine of the passionless wise man. Christians are allowed to be afraid, to be sad, to desire and rejoice, as long as they do so for good reasons and in the proper measure. He then inquires whether death is a good reason for Christians to sorrow. On the one hand, death, he explains, is for humans a true ill, the gravest, in fact, because it dissolves the natural unity of body and soul. On the other hand, Christians lead their entire earthly lives in the hope for perfect happiness in eternal life with God. The entire city of God pilgrimages through time to find home in eternity. Therefore, the dying Christian should not be filled with sorrow, but with hope and pleasant anticipation for the beyond. The Apostle Paul, for example, writes to the Philippians of how he desires to depart and be with Christ, that is, of his joyful anticipation of death. That's the letter to the Philippians 1:23. At the least, the thought of the blessed life should prevent Christians from being sorrowful in the face of death beyond the appropriate measure. Why is Christ then sorrowful about his approaching death in such a manner that implies that his reason has lost control over his affections? Augustine uses Latin wordplay when he writes that Christ is not perishing, but is seeking us. So in Latin, that is, non perit, sed nos querit. He doesn't perish, but he seeks us. Christ, Augustine asserts, is sorrowful for the sake of the weak Christians. To feel hope, confidence, and joy in the face of death is a high Christian ideal. So high that few reach it, if there are any, Augustine says. Most Christians are weak. They do not conform to the ideal. When death comes, their sorrow does not remain within the bounds established by reason and by hope. It rather possesses the whole soul, including the reason. Augustine observes that someone who endeavors his entire life to hold a Christian attitude and at the end of his life realizes that he is much less secure in his faith than he wanted to be and hoped to be, could fall into despair and deem himself lost. Such a death, Augustine contends, would be far worse than the bodily one. Accordingly, he believes that Christ sorrowed over his approaching bodily death in order to prevent humans from despairing before their own death. Quote, "What else then does Christ's being troubled signify but that, by voluntarily assuming the likeness of their weakness, he comforted the weak members in his own body, that is, in his church, to the end that, if any of his own are still troubled at the approach of death, they may fix their gaze upon him, and so be kept from thinking themselves castaways on this account and being swallowed up in the more grievous death of despair." Unquote. He thus concludes that, quote, "It was not through any infirmity of mind, but in the fullness of power that he was troubled. And so no despair of salvation need arise in our minds when we are troubled, not in the possession of power, but in the midst of our weakness." Unquote. When a person exceedingly sorrows over death and sees Christ sorrowing in this manner too, he is consoled in his conscience that he is not strong enough to sorrow in the appropriate manner. Christ, Augustine writes, sorrows in this situation, quote, "that in his trouble we may behold ourselves." Unquote. Like Thomas, Augustine maintains that Christ in Gethsemane and in his prayer to be spared from death is not himself speaking, for he is the rock that never falters. But for Augustine, it is ultimately we ourselves who Christ allows to speak. So when Christ says, quote, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful even unto death," unquote, he is simultaneously saying, quote, "Hear in me the voice of your infirmity. I transfer to myself your causes for trembling, and I pave the way for your marching along." Unquote. This way is not for the strong and wise, but for the weak, who fear failing in their infirmity. For Augustine, Christ is strong, but not only to teach us, but also in order to render himself weak, so that we may be comforted in our weakness. If we throw a glance back from here to Plato's Phaedo, how do Jesus' tears compare to Socrates' cheerfulness in the face of death? In Augustine's view, Jesus is as strong as Socrates. He is a morally perfect human being, and as such, Jesus is not afraid of death. Both Jesus and Socrates are pedagogues. That is, they teach their friends that death is not to be feared because the soul will live on. And they both know that their disciples may be too weak to act according to this teaching. Socrates admonished his friends, making them ashamed of their behavior, whereas Jesus takes our sorrow upon himself, so we must not be ashamed of our fear of death, even though we know it is wrong. One might say that Plato has a more optimistic view of humanity than Augustine, because for Plato, humans can be guided to right behavior and finally to real happiness by admonishing. Augustine, however, sees that humans might fall in despair when realizing their own inability in living up to the teaching, even if admonished. Therefore, they need a teacher who they can look at for comfort, even in the moment of weakness and failure. Thank you very much for your attention.